We're going to look at the anatomy of the muscles of the abdominal wall, or more accurately, the muscles of the anterior and lateral abdominal walls, because we've got this whole thing, this whole trunk, this whole tube thing going on here, and the muscles of the back are something else. If I remember, maybe we'll look at the muscles of the posterior abdominal wall, if I haven't looked at those before, next week. So we might also lump them together and say the anterolateral abdominal wall, because we have layers of muscle here. And we need to think about why we have layers of muscle here, what they do. It's more than just movements and more than just your six-pack. And really, if we look at where they run from and where they run to, like any muscle, but also how they overlap and work together, we'll get a better understanding of how this functions as a unit, which is really important functionally and when problems occur. All right, something like that. Tried to pick a time of day where the kids had gone home. I failed. This person does not have any abdominal wall muscles, but will be very useful in showing us where they attach. But this person does, and we can see some of the layers here. But the skeleton does show us something pretty important, right? We have a rib cage here, so we have a body wall. We have a pelvis down here, and we have nothing in between the two. And yet you know that we have a lot of abdominal viscera. We have the gastrointestinal tract and lots of organs, all sorts of things in here that we need to keep in here. So that then is a major function of the muscles of the anterolateral abdominal walls, is to form a wall, to be a wall, to hold all this stuff in place and protect it. And when that wall breaks down, that's when the inside bits start to get out. We have various opposing pressures here. So that's another function of these muscles, is we can increase the pressure inside the abdomen. The abdomen and the thorax are linked and yet separated by the diaphragm. The diaphragm can move up and down. So you can change pressures in your abdomen and affect the pressure in your thorax. I'm doing it right now. What happens to your abdominal muscles when you cough, sneeze? If you haven't noticed before, pay attention next time. If you raise the intra-abdominal pressure, you can void things out of the abdomen during defecation, micturition. You know, when you contract to empty the bladder, well, the detrusor muscle of the bladder, that's under autonomic control. You're not actually contracting that. You're contracting the muscles of your abdominal wall to increase the pressure in your abdomen, which pushes down on the bladder in the pelvis and pushes the urine out of the bladder, things like that. Vomiting as well, pushing things out from the stomach up the esophagus. That's intra-abdominal pressure. When you're lifting heavy things to support the trunk and the limbs that are attached to the trunk, you take a deep breath, and you sometimes hold your breath, and you increase the abdominal pressure. So you know, when you have a lot of pressure inside a tube, that's a stronger tube than having a tube with no pressure in it, then it's floppy. If you think about spacesuits, they go rigid when the air inside them is against a vacuum on the outside. The pressure difference is such that the tube goes rigid like a balloon. Same with our abdominal pressure raising. So when you lift things, you raise your intra-abdominal pressure. You're using your abdominal muscles. So you probably use them more than you realize, and it's more important to keep the strength in these abdominal muscles than maybe you realize. And if they're forming the wall, then if they fail, if they become weak, then problems can follow. So these are also functions of the muscles of the abdominal wall. Muscle is quite a good building material, particularly if you match it with various connective tissues to hold it in place. It makes a nice, thick, strong, tough, mobile thing that you can make various shapes out of. So we're forming a tube, we're forming a trunk to keep everything inside and protect it. And also, because we're vertebrates, we like to move our vertebrae, and the muscles of the abdominal walls take part in that, in flexion of the trunk, lateral flexion of the trunk, rotation and things like that. The other thing is that these things, so we have the muscles of the abdominal wall, and then we have muscles of the back. Those have all got to work together and be balanced for this trunk system, this muscular system of the trunk, to function normally. And then we have these great big things hanging off down here. The lower limb is a heavy, powerful thing. It has muscles running from here down to there. So then the lower limbs are also hanging from the trunk. So don't consider the muscles of the abdominal wall in isolation. Link them to the muscles and movements of the back, the muscles and movements of the lower limb, and this will all make a lot more sense. But it will be a lot more complex, I'm afraid. Right. Now, if we're going to think about the muscles, we might as well think about all the other layers so that it makes more sense. This is covered in skin. We remove the skin, we see superficial fascia. That's the fascia we see in most places in the body, holding things together. Now, superior to the umbilicus, we see superficial fascia like we do elsewhere in the body. Inferior to the umbilicus, down here, we see a Camper's fascia, which is the more superficial layer, and Camper's fascia is quite a fatty fascia. So you may well find, I certainly do, that there's kind of like a band of fat here, and it's like a band, it's like a waistline of fat, and that's because the Camper's fascia is very good at holding on to fat, because fat is good, fat's a reserve of energy, fat keeps us warm. So the Camper's fascia is here, and then the Scarpa's fascia is a deeper layer, maybe a bit denser, still not very thick, but pretty dense, and that's continuous with the fascia of the lower limbs, the fascia lata. It's continuous with the fascia of the perineum, the Colles fascia. So that's something you might come across. So we have to go through the Camper's fascia, the Scarpa's fascia, to get to the muscles underneath. But that still looks like we've got some fascia here. It's not, and that leads to the other issue we have here. Right, this white line in the middle is the linea alba, literally white line in Latin. Romans, when they were racing around the track, they had a white line down the middle, I think, called the linea alba. Anyway, so the linea alba is a key structural thing here for us when we're considering all of these muscles. And what we're actually seeing here is something quite special, which we'll come back to later. Okay, so if I twist you that away, this is the most superficial layer of muscle. This is the external oblique muscle layer. The external oblique muscle layer, can you see the fibers are running in this direction? It's running from the ribs, so we've got serratus anterior and some other muscles up here which it really kind of tightly interdigitates with. But it's running from the anterior surfaces of ribs 5 to 12. Remember 11 and 12 are these floating guys around here, right? But so it's running from the ribs around to the linea alba, that white line, which is now not here, to the pubic tubercle down here, and this is the iliac crest, so to the anterior half of the iliac crest. So it's running around here, going down here and attaching to here. So between these two bony points we have the inguinal ligament, which is a good attachment. So anyway, so we have external oblique coming around here. But if I said that the external oblique muscle layer runs to the linea alba, how does that work? It doesn't look like it's running to the linea alba, and it looks like it's running this far. How does it get over there then? Right, well, we'll come back to that. So that's the external oblique muscle layer. Fibers running in this direction, so anteriorly and inferiorly, generally, not entirely, but generally running in this direction. Now, if we take that muscle layer off, we can see the next muscle layer. This is the internal oblique muscle. Look, the fibers of the internal oblique muscle are running in the opposite direction, 90 degrees to the external oblique fibers over the top. They're running anteriorly and superiorly. And they're also running from the anterior half of the iliac crest, and they're running up to these ribs here, but they're running up to the costal cartilages. They're also running to the linea alba, but again, we don't see them running to the linea alba, so how do they get there? Now, back here, there is a significant fascia, connective tissue sheet, tied into a number of things back here. It gets called the thoracolumbar fascia. It's kind of like a diamond-shaped fascia, which lots of things attach to. And if lots of things attach to it, then they in turn attach to one another. Now, the internal oblique muscle is also coming from the thoracolumbar fascia around here. So it's properly wrapping around. And then it runs up to ribs 10 to 12. See, we're seeing these ribs here, 10 to 12. And it will also connect, it'll also insert into the pubis bone through the conjoined tendon, something we're going to come back to later because we need to add a bit more anatomy before we can describe the conjoined tendon. So most of the fibres are running in this direction, but not entirely. That's the internal oblique muscle layer. The third layer, the deeper layer, is the transversus abdominis. I think I'm going to have to dissect. Oh, he's lost a lung. So the deepest layer we can see running around. So these fibres are running transversely. We can kind of see the three layers there. External oblique, internal oblique, transversus abdominis. So this is the transversus abdominis layer running around like this. And again, it's running to the linea alba. So again, the transversus abdominis muscle is also wrapping around from the thoracolumbar fascia. It's going to attach, we can't see it here, but to the costal cartilages of ribs, 7 to 12. And again, it's going to also attach to the anterior iliac crest and run all the way around to the linea alba and to some other connective tissues as well. But you get the gist. We've got 3 layers of muscle. Some fibres running in that direction, some fibres running in that direction, and some fibres running around in that direction. If you were trying to make a wall out of tape and hold something inside, would you build it like that? Seems pretty sensible, right? And we see the same organisation in the intercostal muscles between the ribs, suggesting this is like a segmental tube animal's thing, right? So again, in the intercostal muscles, we see 3 layers of muscle, and we see different directions of fibres as well, because we're forming a body wall. While we're talking about the intercostal stuff, these muscles are innervated by the nerves running around the body wall, which are the intercostal nerves are running around here, innervating these muscles from about T7 to T11, because the one at T12 gets called the subcostal nerve because it's sub the ribs, it's under the ribs. And then we have the ilio-inguinal and ilio-hypogastric nerves, which come from the L1 level and are going to curve around and descend actually in between these layers of muscles, so they innervate them as they go past as well. So the muscles of the body wall are innervated by the nerves of the body wall. Sensible. Okay, but what about the main attraction then? The rectus abdominis muscles have become some strange indicator of, modern health, fitness, attractiveness. And there are 2 rectus abdominis muscles, one on either side, separated and joined by the white line, the linea alba. And then we have these tendinous bands, these tendinous intersections running across transversely, which then chunk this muscle up into bands, giving the 6-pack. But I said that the campus fascia is a really good fascia for storing fat. So to show off these muscles, you need to get rid of a lot of body fat, because kind of one of the last stores of body fat is here, which means that you need to get a really low overall body fat percentage to get rid of the fat covering these muscles. And then they don't have to be particularly big to see them, you just have to be very lean. But if they get larger from doing sit-ups or whatever exercises you like, crunches and hanging leg raises and all the beauties, then they will, they'll get thicker like any other muscle. So rectus means straight. So we have these 2 straight muscles running from the xiphoid process and the costal cartilages down to the superior edge of the pubis bone, the pubic crest. The pubic crest and the pubic symphysis here, and then running up to the xiphoid process. This is the most inferior part of the sternum here, the xiphoid process, and then these costal cartilages. So they're forming an anterior band. Oh, and there's another muscle that I always forget. This is pyramidalis. Only about 80% of people have these. There's one on either side. It makes a triangle, right? So pyramidalis is anterior to rectus abdominis, but again it's running from the pubic crest and the pubic symphysis to the linea alba. It's kind of a bit of a reinforcement down here. Okay, how's that? Those are the muscles of the anterolateral abdominal wall. We have 3 layers of external oblique, internal oblique, and transversus abdominis laterally. We have rectus abdominis anteriorly, and we have the pyramidalis muscles as well, which, you know, whatever. But I said that these muscles laterally insert into the linea alba. How can that happen if we can see rectus abdominis? Well, we can see what's happening here. So a muscle, and these are flat muscles, they can become flat tendons. And a flat tendon or a flat tendinous sheet is an aponeurosis. It's very connective tissue-y rather than contractile. And what happens is the external oblique muscle becomes an aponeurosis here at the margin of the rectus abdominis muscle, and that aponeurosis runs anteriorly to reach the linea alba and inserts into it. And that's what we see here. That's what this white shading is on this right side, where we have the external oblique muscle. It becomes an aponeurosis and continues over to the linea alba. The internal oblique muscle, when it reaches the margin of the rectus abdominis muscle, becomes an aponeurosis, splits into 2, and half of it passes anteriorly to rectus abdominis and half of it passes posteriorly to rectus abdominis, so surrounding it. And then the transversus abdominis muscle, the deepest layer, does the same thing but stays posterior. So all of these muscles wrap around rectus abdominis to get to the linea alba. Now, do you see how this is a functional unit? All of these muscles are tied together, layered over one another, interact with one another. So it's a bit daft just training one muscle. You need to train them all for this system to work together, and you need to train the muscles of the back if you want to maintain strength or increase strength. This stuff's all got to work together, so you've got to balance it. Sure, you can train each muscle in isolation, but train each muscle in isolation. Now, I talked about those layers, and that's what happens generally, but we have something down here called the arcuate line, where those layers change a bit, and that's covered in another video called the arcuate line, probably. By the way, Google, they got quite good at search, so if you want to find any topics and you're wondering whether I've covered them, just put my name into YouTube, the search bit at the top, and the topic you're interested in. If I've done it, it'll come up. Okay. I said I'd tell you about the conjoint tendon. The conjoint tendon is this aponeurosis of the transverse abdominis muscle and the internal oblique muscle running down inferiorly to the pubic crest and the superior pubic ramus. That's this branch of the pubis extending up here. So that's what we're seeing here. So these deep aponeuroses are coming together, blending. It becomes more tendon-like. So that's the conjoint tendon anchoring these muscles, particularly transversus abdominis and interior oblique, to the pubic crest and the superior pubic ramus. That is the conjoint tendon. So in the male, we have the inguinal canal here, which is connecting the contents of the scrotum with the pelvic, inside the pelvis. It goes through the body wall into the pelvis, right? The inguinal canal passes through these layers that we've talked about to connect the contents of the scrotum to the abdominopelvic cavity. The conjoined tendon forms an important part of the posterior wall of that. So if it's weakened, there's a risk of then forming a direct inguinal hernia. Inguinal canal, that's covered in another video too. All right, final word for you today is a semilunar line. This lateral border of the rectus abdominis muscle, there's kind of like a curved line here where the lateral muscles become an aponeurosis and form the rectus sheath, which is what those aponeurosis, what those connective tissues form around rectus abdominis. This is the semilunar line here at the border where that change occurs. Okay, so those are the muscles of the anterolateral abdominal wall. They're very important in forming a tube, keeping all of the abdominal and pelvic viscera inside, important in supporting, maintaining, and sometimes increasing pressures inside the abdomen, thorax, pelvis, and that sort of thing, and of course in moving the trunk. And you can exercise them in isolation, you can consider them in isolation, but then you should consider them all as a functional unit and how they all link together. Imagine if you made that tube of tape with just one layer and in one direction. How would it fail? How would it split? How weak would it be? And you'd build it with multiple layers in multiple directions, right? So train those multiple layers in multiple directions. Stay strong, everybody. It's the key. It's the key. Right, see you next week. I'll check my list, see if I've done posterior abdominal wall muscles. If I haven't, I'll try and remember to do that, which means I'll probably forget between now and then and get distracted and talk about something else that I get interested in. All right.